Okay, so I'm now going to, on my list, pass over to Juho Lipponen. You are good, you are here, that's terrific. So Juho runs the Clean Energy Ministerial, and if you've not come across the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, then you've seriously missed out, because the Clean Energy Ministerial tries to marshal together the ministerial energy minister level activity in governments worldwide, and has an extremely good black book of top nations who regularly attend the meetings which Juho coordinates, and also presents public seminars, global seminars by the web with top speakers on highly relevant topics. So Juho's going to introduce some of that to us now, and talk about his work with the CEM. Over to you.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you for the invitation to this event. Really nice to be here. I got a little promotion from you, Stuart. I don't run the whole SEM. I'm not. Maybe that. Yeah, that's an aspiration for the future. But I'm very. I work closely with the SEM wider team and coordinating the CCUS work under the SEM. So that should be clear to everybody. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the Clean Energy Ministerial, really, this is a process. It doesn't have a legal form, if you like, really. It brings together 29 countries from across the globe. You see them on the green in this map. It's north and south, all types of countries, and to collaborate on voluntary basis on clean energy deployment. And deployment really is the word here to stress, as opposed to research and innovation in this case. Obviously, all these SEM countries are investing in research and innovation, but in this very forum, they are discussing deployment and how they can together help accelerate all clean energy technologies across all relevant sectors. So it's a wide platform and a wide collaborative process. And so collaboration, learning, sharing best practice, those are the further key words that really describe SEM. Yeah, countries listed there on the left-hand side, and you see the map as well. Ministerial meetings where ministers actually come together, that's once a year. 12th SEM was hosted by Chile in June, earlier this summer. And the next SEM will be run by the United States next year. And then each time a member hosts a meeting. Next slide, please. So the CCUS initiative then is one of these work streams under the SEM. And we are a platform, we bring together 12 of the 29 SEM governments with the common objective to accelerate carbon capture together. The flags of members are there on the left-hand side. And again, indeed, we also work on strategy and policy level, not really research or pilot level. And we're government-led, but it's not really government only. So there's lots of collaboration with the industry, finance sector, other key organizations who are relevant to deployment. If we go to the next slide, please. So coming then closer to the topic of CCUS and where we see this ship being today. Now, starting from the bottom left, I think it's safe to say that over the past years, the strategic narrative around carbon capture has really significantly, I would say, rejuvenated. It's much more positive than what it was before, and I think the opportunity is seen much more than it was before. Of course, it's still not easy. However, I think the direction and the recognition for carbon capture really has been moved ahead tremendously. Now, then moving up the left-hand side of the graph, what's also positive is the policy ambitions and policy move in various countries, not only the CEM member countries, but looking at the CEM CCUS member countries, 10 out of 12 have net zero targets. If you look at the UNFCCC process, 8 out of 12 have CCUS firmly in the long-term scenarios. 6 have in NDCs. I think we'll talk a lot about whether CCUS should be explicitly in NDCs or not. I think there's probably different schools of thought here as to how much it should be mentioned, but this is the reality. 6 have. But then 11 out of these 12 countries actually have in place specific policy to drive CCUS projects. And that's the really important piece. And if you can click one more time, yeah, here's a bit more detail. I'm not proposing to go into all of this, but a lot of countries are really putting effort today to drive forward. We have the ambitious climate agenda infrastructure package in the United States, the 45Q tax credits. Elsewhere in North America, there's movement as well with new strategy by Canada, tax credits being discussed. Over the European side, various European fund structures that can help carbon capture, innovation fund, and we wait for those decisions later in the year. And then the various countries who are moving ahead with their investment, their commitments of various funds, business models, support structures, and so forth. And elsewhere in the world, South Africa is strongly reactivating their CCUS program. ADNOC in the UAE has a target to ramp up by 500% to 6 million tons per year in the next 10 years, and so on and so on. So I think there's lots of good positive movement in the specific CCUS policy, and that's really what counts. And then moving towards the right of that slide, of course, we also have an increasing number of projects. GCCSI and others track these numbers. What's also interesting is that there seems to be much more discussion on the business opportunity. Announcements of projects, companies offering carbon capture as a service to industries, new technology offerings coming to the market, also new sectors becoming active like waste to energy, especially in Europe. Lots more discussion on technology and opportunity for carbon capture in that sector too. So there's a lot of positive movement here. But then moving on that circle, collaboration really remains critical. Investing in CCUS is today still very much a three-legged stool at a minimum. Governments, industry, finance sector. We need all these to play together. Hopefully in the future, it's not a three-legged stool, but maybe a two-legged one. But this is where we are today. And this is, of course, I think the picture is positive, but we're not quite there yet. And we need to actively keep this wheel turning. So if you click one more time, there's a little addition to the slide title that we need active engagement to actually keep this wheel turning through government policy, industry commitment, and finance sector willingness to invest. Next slide, please. So briefly, so against that background, this is what the CEM CCUS initiative does. So top left corner, if you click one more time, first objective is to ensure that the CEM process, where all these ministers come together, gives due consideration for carbon capture. At the 12th CEM, we had quite a lot of attention on carbon capture, several events, several ministers mentioning it, and this we thought was very, very positive. But we don't only work with the CEM, if you like. I think our job is also to try to keep CCUS in discussions in other forums too. If you click one more time, top right-hand side of the slide, our second objective really is to be this platform for governments, industry, and finance community to be able to come together in conversation. And you see some of the partnership organizations on the top right-hand corner here. No real surprises there. Next click, please. Not very stylish to do animations this way, but working very well. we try to be helpful to facilitate also the short and long-term investment opportunities, and really bringing governments, finance sector, and industry together to discuss real opportunities in projects. In January this year, we had a large meeting convention discussing opportunities in Europe and in Canada. In July, we brought several Asian countries together to discuss strategic CO2 and CCS hubs, and with very active discussion among the key stakeholders. And we hope to do more of these as opportunities arise. And final click here on this slide, we obviously disseminate best practice and try to show the good example from the countries that are our members on policy, on technology, on sector approaches as well, and so forth. On YouTube, if you search for SEM CCUS webinars, you will find our content. Next and final slide, really, please. I just wanted to highlight one particular aspect of our work, which has been to reach out to the finance sector. We set up a finance sector lead group for CCUS, which is a collection of 20 plus or so global international banks and finance institutions, with the intention that we should organize something that allows the finance sector to actually come together and discuss CCUS, learn the government policies and aspirations and views on this, but also allow our members to learn, well, what's best for us to do to make this an important and interesting proposition for the banks. And I think it's really positive. A lot of the banks have gotten really active in CCUS recently, ranging from just learning about it to building actual CCUS teams and to investigating real investment opportunities. And that's really helpful. And this is something we will hope to continue and highlight. We did key financing principles for CCUS last year, which is a really super simple set of 10 principles that hopefully which can somehow crystallize the thinking among the finance sector to see the CCUS as an opportunity in their clean energy portfolio. Next one, please. This is the end. Finally, we are on LinkedIn and Twitter, and there's an email address here on this slide as well. So please get in touch if you want to. I'll leave it at that, and happy to take part in the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Okay, Juho, thank you very much indeed. That's a very clear, well-paced presentation showing the international coordination and international banding together, which hopefully is starting to happen. I'm now going to pass to Samantha McCulloch. Hopefully you're online somewhere. Oh, good, right. Because with this sort of presentation, you never know if people are here till they pop up. So Samantha is head of the CCUS unit at the International Energy Agency in Paris, and is a long-time CCS aficionado and authored several IEA publications, including the recent authoritative IEA Energy Technology Perspectives special report on CCUS in the clean energy transition. So I'm going to ask Samantha to talk about her work, or the IEA work, on CCS in net zero pathways. And again, hopefully Samantha will stick around for questions at 11:45. So over to you, Samantha.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's been an extremely interesting discussion, I think, already. So I'm going to focus my comments today really in sharing some of the highlights around the role of CCUS in meeting net zero goals according to IEA analysis. So I think many of you will be familiar with the fact that in May this year, the IEA released a roadmap for the global energy sector to reach net zero by 2050. Now, this report was really very much in response to the growing momentum that we're seeing behind pledges to net zero. Many of these pledges from governments are targeting net zero by 2050, but indeed some countries are aiming for an earlier achievement of net zero, some a bit later. But in total, these commitments cover around 70% of global energy sector CO2 emissions, so fairly significant coverage. And really what we were trying to do with this report was recognising that although these commitments and these pledges have been made, in many cases, the work still needs to be done to really understand what is required to achieve these goals. And so with our net zero report, we were trying to paint a detailed global picture of what it would take to get the energy sector to hit net zero by 2050. So next slide, please. So a transition to net zero will come with many, many milestones along the way. So this is for technology innovation, for technology development, and certainly for policy, which we've already been discussing today. Our report sets out more than 400 sort of milestones at a global level to reaching net zero. But just to highlight from a CCUS perspective, I've put boxes around some of the milestones. In particular, more than 4 billion tonnes of CO2 would need to be captured globally by 2035. And of course, many of you will appreciate this is from a fairly small start today. So around 40 million tonnes being captured today. And then by 2050, when we're reaching net zero, more than 7.6 billion tonnes of CO2 is captured. So this is obviously a very ambitious scale up that really does reflect, I think, the challenges and the opportunities that are inherent in this net zero pathway. So we would need a major boost here across all technologies, so not just CCUS. Just to put some of this in context, just in the period to 2030, we would need to see energy efficiency improvements being implemented at a rate that's 3 times faster than what we've seen in the past 2 decades. In terms of solar and wind capacity, this would need to be installed at 4 times the record set in 2020. And electric vehicles would go from 5% of car sales today to 60% by 2030. So while the CCUS numbers are ambitious and certainly a major scale up is required, this is something that we would see across a broad range of technologies and measures. Next slide, please. So looking now specifically of the role of CCUS, we would need an immediate acceleration in the rollout of projects. This is to reach almost 1.7 billion tonnes of CO2 capture by 2030. So in our analysis, the CO2 capture is applied in many sectors. This is from fuel transformation, power generation, heavy industry, and technologies such as direct air capture all emerge at scale. In the period to 2030, most of the growth in CCUS comes from low carbon hydrogen production, from heavy industry, and from retrofits in the power sector. And then post 2030, more than 1/3 of the growth that we see is in heavy industry. So this is in the yellow in the chart, which includes both process emissions and fuel combustion. And then over the period to 2050, there is a growing role for carbon removal technologies, so in particular BECCS and direct air capture. And we have around 2.4 billion tonnes captured from BECCS and DAC in 2050. Most of this is for carbon removal, so 1.9 gigatons is directed to carbon removal, but there's also around 500,000 tonnes of CO2 captured from the air that's used to produce synthetic fuels. Next slide, please. And finally, really to achieve a net zero pathway would of course require a massive increase in average annual investments in clean energy. These investments overall in clean energy would triple to around $5 trillion a year by 2030. So it's really critical, of course, that this investment finds its way to the sectors and the projects where it's most needed. So this would include in emerging markets and developing economies. And just to make the point that today emerging markets and developing economies account for around 2/3 of the world's population, but only about 1/5 of the global investment in clean energy. And so for CCUS, the scale up in investment is very significant. In our sustainable development scenario, which reaches net zero a bit later in 2070, investment increases to an average of more than 50 billion a year by 2030 from around 1 billion a year today. And this investment is broadly equally split between power generation in industry and fuel transformation. And more than half of this investment is in advanced economies, but China also sees significant investment. And for a net zero by 2050 pathway, so the NZE scenario, the average annual investment would reach almost 80 billion a year globally for CCUS. So clearly this will require improved access to all types of finance for CCUS, including debt finance, as well as support from climate and development finance organisations in the case of emerging markets. And obviously much strengthened policy support to encourage in much greater private investment. So just to make a point that while we're obviously not quite on track for this level of investment today, I would highlight that we have seen very significant momentum for CCUS recently. I think Juho has said we've had a rejuvenated narrative, and I'd certainly agree with this. I think I have someone who's been working on CCUS for quite some time. The amount of interest and activity that we're seeing currently is not something I've seen in my career. I think the strength in climate commitments, and particularly net zero targets, coupled with an improved investment environment with more policy support being available in many regions, has really given a significant boost to CCUS and to project activity. So just based on our tracking, we're seeing at least one major project being announced each week in 2021. So that's more than 40 projects already that we've seen be announced this year. And if all projects were planning on going ahead in terms of the project pipeline, we would see more than fivefold increase in CCUS by 2030. Now, I think John Gibbons at the start of the conference reminded us that many of these projects may not succeed, may not go ahead, but I'd still suggest there's some room for optimism that we're going to see some meaningful progress this decade. So with that, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Samantha, for very clearly outlining the IUA pathway. We've just got 1 minute, so I'm going to ask you one question if you want to come back on. So just to be clear on what you're projecting is a sort of policy ask, really, isn't it? It's not a prediction which is consequent on existing actions. It's really a presentation about this is what has to happen to get us to where we want to be. Is that correct?
This is an optimized pathway to achieve a global net zero 2050 outcome for the energy sector. Yeah. And okay. It's not the current pathway that the global energy sector is on.
So yeah, so full of optimism. So that's great. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm just got that one. I'm now going to pass on to the next speaker. Okay, so just to remind everybody, Frank is an engineer working for Southern Company, and Frank is going to talk to us about the National Carbon Capture Center in the US, and also the international network of test centers. Over to Frank.
Yes, thanks, Stuart. I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this panel. It's been a good experience. I've been active in international collaboration over the years. The last year and a half I've been stuck in the US, so it's very nice to hear proper English. I look forward to seeing you in person in the future. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk about neutral test facilities with the goal of broad knowledge sharing that others have talked about. But the knowledge sharing that we are engaged in is technical information from test sites. I'll briefly describe the NCCC because that's where I work as an introduction to knowledge sharing that's available through ITCN. The NCCC is a DOE funded, 80% funded DOE engineering test scale facility at a Southern Company coal-fired power plant for developing carbon capture technologies from point sources. We recently added a natural gas-fired boiler so that we also are able to test natural gas, flue gas sources also. Our partners are the Electric Power Research Institute and the partners listed over on the right. We have added Exxon and Total over the last couple of years in the final negotiations with another large oil and gas company, since we are turning our test to include natural gas sources. We're managed and operated by a Southern company located in Wilsonville, Alabama. But what we offer is a real world power setting, real world conditions to test technologies as they come from fundamental lab scale research. When we were constructed in 2008 and 2009, the intent was always to do small scale testing at first and then to scale up to support large scale testing. But as you know, the large scale facilities haven't come to realization as quickly as we had hoped. But as Samantha mentioned, there is a lot of optimism now as we're moving towards that soon. So what we have is a technical staff of about 100 people that can help with the design and installation and testing, support and analysis. Very critical to keep these tests going once you've gone to the trouble and the expense of developing a technology and coming to a larger scale, to go to a facility that focuses on research and has the resources to keep that test going and to modify it as you enter the test plan to improve the goals of the test and to address any issues that come up during the test plan. So I have a lot of activity internationally. There's 7 different countries have tested with us, and we're the co-founder of the ITCN network that I'll talk about soon. We like to talk about how smart we are and how skilled we are, but that bottom number is very helpful also. It takes a lot of money to do these tests. I always say that these tests are small, but they're very complex still, and they're still expensive to come out of the lab into a real world setting. There's a lot of risk and a lot of expense and scale up. Next slide, please. So some of the accomplishments of the NCCC, over 117,000 hours of operation over the last decade, over 68 different technologies tested from 40 different developers. We are constantly expanding, looking at alternative generation, gas injection, analytical support, constantly improving our facility to be able to accommodate the developing tests that are in the pipeline. We look at advanced solvents, membranes, and solid sorbents. We have 18 technologies in the queue. Over the last couple of weeks, NETL, DOE in the US, has done their annual meetings with their contractors. There was over 100 presentations of technologies in the queue of making improvements and looking at cost reductions and performance improvements on CCS. In addition to the point source for cleanup of coal flue gas, I mentioned natural gas, flue gas point source cleanup also, but we're also looking at the support of carbon net negative goals and supportive technologies deployment at scale, moving towards commercialization. There's been 8 technologies that have scaled up to over 10 megawatts that moved on to other facilities, and we're constantly looking at those technologies also to inform our test at the NCCC, but also to contribute to their success with improving those technologies as they're deployed. Next slide, please. So all the all the work that we're doing and all the knowledge that we're developing, a lot of it public knowledge that we can share. If you multiply that times 13, then you have the International Test Center Network. The ITCN was developed to share knowledge on operating test facilities. There's just a lot of unique knowledge learned from each of the settings as we scale up. These are the test centers around the world that have joined the ITCN, and there's several others that are asking to join. We meet a couple of times a year. We have conference calls to share information. The pandemic has slowed us down some the last year and a half, but we're looking at ways to re-engage heavily as the optimism grows for deploying these technologies. So in addition to just sharing operating knowledge among the teams, we also look at facilitating collaboration on technology development of scale up. We help each other with proposals for funding from governments, and look at other ways to help each other as we move forward towards developing technologies that are commercially viable. To focus our work, we focus on one technical area per year. I've listed the couple of recent technical focus areas with a recent emphasis on open access technology, as most of the work over the last decade in this area of technology development on these technologies at these neutral test sites have been open. As we move towards scale up and more commercial activity, there will be an issue of making that knowledge on scale up more available. So open access technology and open sharing of knowledge is something that we are emphasizing with the network. Next slide, please. So this slide represents the value of the ITCN. There's hundreds of people behind each of these groups. So we show the leaders of the members of the ITCN. If something good or bad happens at the NCCC, it's nice to have friends around the world to talk through it and compare notes and to learn from each other. So thanks for the time, and I'll stop there and look forward to the question and answer session.
Okay, that's great, Frank. Thank you very much indeed. So I'll pass over to Scott Foster. So Scott and I don't think have met at all. So this is an introduction on paper. So thank you very much, Scott, for making time to come here. So Scott is the Director of Sustainable Energy at the United Nations Economic Commission in Europe, and he's been doing that work since 2011. And the job of this comes out of Scott's background in as a civil engineer and also as an MBA from California, Berkeley, to try in his present job to assist energy stakeholders in making good technology choices and mobilizing their investment, which is, of course, the crucial thing, not just looking at it and talking about it, but actually making an investment. So I'll ask Scott to talk now for his 15 minutes or so. Max, over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, is a bit of a misrepresentation of who we are. Our membership actually includes 56 member countries, Canada and the United States, Western, Central, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, Israel, Turkey. So it's quite a large region. People think Europe and immediately we're very focused. It's broader than that. We are one of the 5 regional commissions in the UN system, the others being Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia Pacific. The thing I think we do the best is our convening power. We bring a broad spectrum of countries together to talk about issues. And we depend very much on all of our expert communities, bringing thousands of experts in various areas. At the end of the day, the fact that we're able to get agreement on technical cooperation in specific areas, I think is a critically valuable component. On that technical cooperation area, I'd like to mention to the group that we developed with our group of experts on cleaner electricity systems recommendations for the UNFCCC back in 2017 on CCS and on CCUS. And the fact that we were able to get those 56 countries around the table to come to an agreement that we should seek policy parity with other low and no carbon energy sources was an important step. So our work in that area is continuing. Now, the UNECE region, just like the world, is very dependent on fossil fuels. So 80% of the energy mix is fossil. And our own analysis, it's very consistent with what Samantha and what Juho have presented, but we're going to need to cut or capture roughly 90 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2050 if we're going to get to the 2-degree target. That's from our own pathways work. And if you look at the spectrum of activities that have to be taken, it really is an all of the above proposition. So we're going to have to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. We've got to improve energy efficiency. We've got to develop renewables, nuclear energy, and hydrogen. Now, when I say CCS and talk about a future role for fossil in the energy mix, or I talk about nuclear and a future role for nuclear in the future energy mix, people get very excited. There are such animated perspectives on this. As an institution, as an organization, we are obliged to remain agnostic on technology choices. That's going to be up to the countries. We are encouraging countries, and we've come up with 2 documents with 6 recommendations of how do we get to the 2030 agenda, how do we get to the Paris Agreement. The first one is our commitment trifecta. Samantha put a figure up which was similar to what I'm about to say, but her slice on buildings was surprisingly small. In our view, buildings really are number one. And if we could reduce to achievable levels the amount of energy that's required in buildings, and that includes all forms of energy, that would be major progress. The second one then is on methane management and controlling the amount of methane emissions. The third then is on sustainable resource management and putting in proper systems. It's when we get over to the longer document that we have on a push to pivot that we get to carbon capture and storage. Getting to carbon neutrality is absolutely essential. So we're working in that area. It has to make its contribution, CCS and CCUS. We've come up with a number of documents and briefs recently. We've just produced a CCS technology brief, which really lies out in simple terms for people to understand what the technology is. I saw a little video recently of people who are just massively anti-CCS and CCUS, talking about how it's just a way of transferring funds to the fossil industry. Clearly, we've got work to do. We've got to develop the facts. We've got to be able to convince and persuade. So raising awareness among our membership, raising awareness amongst the public, we think is quite important. In addition to the work on technology that we're doing, we've got ongoing a sub-regional study on geologic CO2 storage. That's in Eastern Europe, that's in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. And we're looking through an initial analysis of the potential and what the policy frameworks that could deliver on that. So we are championing the various technologies and how CCS and CCUS could play a role in a circular carbon economy. At our last commission session, which is leading up to our committee session, to use UN vernacular, we've got our committee coming up in a couple of weeks' time here in Geneva. We are being asked to look at subsidies. What's the impact of subsidies, positive, negative, and what are the secondary effects that they cause? In addition, we're being looked asked to look at mechanisms for greenhouse gas pricing. Both of those are critically important for CCS and CCUS because they underpin the business model. And if you don't have a business model that works, you're not going to have a sustainable policy framework. And without a sustainable policy framework, you're not going to be attracting the financing and the investments that you really need. So this technology, to our view, is key for the hard to abate sectors. We're working very closely with the energy intensive industries. I can mention cement, I can mention steel, and I can mention chemicals. A big area for us will also be transport, and maybe CCS would be able to play a role indirectly in transport. So what would I like to emphasize with you today? You all saw the IPCC report. We are out of time. The structural changes that are going to be needed are much deeper than most people accept, and we've got to get started. The only way we're going to lighten that burden is by getting some of these investments going in. So we've got to get the scale and scope of CCS up. The longer we delay, it's an increasingly steep curve, the cost of that is going to go much greater. The change that will be required will be even more important. So we want to be sharing best practices. We want to have this collaboration. You have mentioned that very perfectly. We have to have multi-stakeholder initiatives that bring together partnerships and deliver outcomes. So those need to be discussed and transparent so we all know what everybody else is doing and we don't duplicate too much efforts. Industry has got to commit to greening. Greening meaning reducing its net CO2 emissions. And industry, private sector has got to lead that structural change. That's where we're going to get the designs, the material efficiencies, the various sustainable energy technologies, and they'll be able to interplay. Government has got to play that supporting role. They've got to put together the investment framework conditions that allow this to proceed. And then the financial sector. That's been covered already, but again, it's got to be underpinned by business models. As long as we had no carbon price, then the U of CCUS became so important, hence enhanced oil recovery, etc. But when you start getting a real carbon price, and we've done our own analysis, it's probably something north of $120 a ton. Others have done analyses showing higher numbers. The longer we wait, the bigger the price because the deeper the change that's required. So what we want to do is scale up with all of the conditions and develop those legal, financial, regulatory frameworks, get that policy parity in place, and get out there and really start demonstrating the contribution that this can make. So as we say, we have to act now. I can go on a very long time, but I know you're a bit tight on time, so I won't go into the details, but we have to collaborate and cooperate. And we're looking forward to working with everybody who's on this call to deliver those results. So with that, I'm actually look forward to participating in the Q&A session and be available for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Scott, for clearly explaining a whole set of activity that I personally didn't know very much about before. So that's great to know. You mentioned several reports that your group and the UN groups are doing. So I've asked Caris, who's supporting this web meeting, to mail you to try and get the links to those, the URL links, so we can post those so everybody can access those, if that's okay. I'm assuming they're public availability.
They are. I'll try to put them in the chat while we're speaking. Great.
Okay, and Caris will also maybe just confirm that so we can put that on the product of this meeting. I'm just going to jump on him. In your talk, Juho, you mentioned that NDC commitments specific on CCS were a bit scarce. And I certainly noticed that around the time of the Paris Agreement. And you raised the question of whether they should be specific or not specific. And obviously, because I'm biased and deeply immersed in all this, I'd like to see them specific. So how do you see this developing for the present COP in Glasgow later this year? Will nation states be more specific on committing to CCS, or are they still tiptoeing around the swimming pool?
I'm not sure if they're going to do really either of these. It's probably going to be somewhere in between, because for example, when we discuss with our members the NDC situation, and so many say that, yeah, well, we kind of for some reasons put it in there because our policy is not to mention technologies there, or you may have some other reasons. However, at the same time, the country has specific CCUS policy being put in place. So I think that's at the end what matters, and whether we very explicitly talk about it at the COP context is perhaps it's important, but it's less important than actually getting those national policies in place. I don't have a sense that there would be a massive new number of countries announcing CCS in their NDC at COP, but I think there will be countries who will talk about it, who will make give presentations, refer to it as one of their as one tool of their toolbox.
Okay, so that's a fair enough answer, but also a very politically balanced answer, as I would expect from the Clean Energy Ministerial. So that's great. So I'll not be too worried then if I don't see a long list of CCS commitments.
I don't think you should be too worried. I think the beef is really going to be then in the national implementation, and even there, if you like, this is personal reflection. 200 countries party to the UNECE, they're not going to be putting CCUS there. But if 15 more important ones do it, that's what's going to count.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point, and I'm just gonna leave you now, Juho. Thanks very much. If people have got questions specific, please type them in the Q&A. Just to let you know that Scott Foster has revealed his UN websites there in the chat, and they'll be circulated later as well. So those reports you mentioned are in the chat, and Miles Allen is back online if anybody wants to ask Miles a question. So I'm going to go to I've got a question from Martin Millwood Hargrave, and I think that's possibly best to Frank. So Martin wants to know, is there such a thing as a breakthrough technology you need in carbon capture? Something which is really going to solve, I guess, the cost and reliability and difficulty problem. Is that a reasonable question or not, Frank?
No, I think it's definitely a reasonable question, and I think that's something that we're all striving for. We at the NCCC have always tried to spend about 50% of our funding developing near commercial technologies, the mean solvents, the solvents that will probably be the first commercialized technology, and then membranes will have some uses in specialized cases. But then there is a lot of hope for the of a breakthrough technology, but there's no denying that they're behind in the development. So it's the timing and the expense to get to the point where you can have them commercial. You hear often of breakthrough technologies and the successes in the lab, but that just takes time to prove it at a larger scale, and then to prove it for financing, and to prove it for selection by governments for larger scale. So hoping for technology breakthroughs, we're still looking for them. There is hope, but it's just something that's not expected to happen over the next couple of years.
Sure. I think my experience, shorter than yours, is exactly identical. It takes a long time to get that developed. Miles, do you want to comment on that in particular? You got your hand up?
Yeah, just to say, I think we should also be asking, what are the breakthrough policies we need in carbon capture? This may not be a technological problem. No matter how cheap we make it, will the environmental movement ever accept carbon capture, or indeed will the public at large ever accept carbon capture if it's seen as a publicly funded subsidy to the fossil fuel industry? We need policies that allow its large-scale deployment without that perspective, without that dirt being able to be thrown at it. So that's, I think, where a lot of the thought needs to focus right now. Why does Greenpeace still oppose stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming? That's a really strange situation that we're in. And yet we are there. And I think those who want to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming need to ask themselves, how do we reframe the policies we're recommending in order to achieve that, such that, you know, the very environmentalists who are supposed to be on our side are not fighting us?
Yeah, well, they're probably not in the room, so they can't answer for themselves. But Scott has his hand up. I think it's a great question, of course. Why not throw the baby out with the bathwater and just hope for the best with your fingers crossed? I'm going to ask Scott. He seems to have his hand up, so hopefully we'll comment on that.
Actually, I won't speak on behalf of Greenpeace, so don't put me in that corner. I did agree with the basic proposition that's just been forward about some of the policy things. We've got 13 of our member states out of 56 who are actually implementing CCS projects. And you can ask yourself, who's next and what's the basis for that? Clearly, it's going to be somebody who's got a great dependence on fossil, who emits a lot of CO2. Clearly, it's going to be somebody who's got the geology framework where storage can actually happen. That leads me to where I think there's a missing link in the whole program, which is the idea of trading and transacting, and the idea of being able to find a storage and using a storage, not obliging everybody to operate within their own national boundaries. I think that would be a major improvement. In terms of dealing with the NGOs who are anti, I'll say everything, there needs to be a conversation about the dire straits we find ourselves in. We are cooking our planet. We have to take urgent steps to fix it. This is one of the solutions. And if they don't understand that, let them come forward with a program that's sensible, that works, and doesn't cause too much social stress. Thank you.
Okay, and Juho has something to add on that.
Yeah, thanks. This was on Miles' point, which I think is really important. And if you look at the sort of policy development for CCUS, we went through the first phase of sort of large government subsidies a while back for the first tranche of projects. I think we're now in some form of a second phase where we can offer types of operational support in various ways, and which many countries are now committing to doing. But that's still not for, you know, really allowing for hundreds upon hundreds of new projects where we need to get. So I think indeed we need to think of, well, what's the major policy way that we can use to get then the next big leap to drive projects forward. And there will be many answers, but certainly what Miles is proposing is something that will appeal to a number of countries.
Okay, and to transfer to Samantha, I think you mentioned in your presentation that many projects have been proposed, but very few have arrived, or at least you should have some view of that from your global IEA perspective. So could you comment about, it's a question, I think from somebody, David Santillo from Greenpeace, has asked us, you know, how accurate will these future project projections be in terms of real delivery?
Well, thanks, Stuart. So I wonder if I can just also comment. I just wanted to jump in on the NDC point. I think I agree with what Juho mentioned earlier about the sort of, you know, individual countries will take decisions as to whether they specify technologies in their NDCs. But for emerging economies that are looking for development finance, mentioning CCUS specifically in the NDC is actually quite important. This is something that the banks are looking to. So I think there's a case there for emphasising that for those that might be seeking development or climate finance. Also, just on this concern around support for CCUS being linked to fossil fuels, I think there's a communication task here also for those of us in the room to emphasise that CCUS is not a fossil fuel technology only. It's obviously important for fossil fuels, but just to emphasise, in our net zero analysis, by 2050, only around 50% of the CO2 being captured is actually related to fossil fuels. 20% is associated with industrial process emissions, and 30% is related to BECCS and DAC. So this is a much broader suite of technologies. So let's, you know, I think there's a narrative challenge here as well, even within the CCUS community, to ensure that we're emphasising the broader role of CCUS. In terms of the question around projects specifically, I think John made the point very well in his introduction that not all projects that are in development will make it to FID and eventually operate. I think this links to the policy challenges that many of them are relying on direct government subsidies. The fact that many of our support programs are targeting individual projects through competitive processes. So by definition, not all projects are going to make it through. So there is a need to have more market-based or broader incentives for investment, things like the 45Q tax credit, carbon pricing, et cetera, that can really create a market for CCUS. In terms of maybe this is a misinterpretation of my presentation, I was presenting an optimized view of the sort of deployment pathway that would be needed for CCUS to meet net zero goals. We are well off track in terms of the projects that are in development and coming online for CCUS to be able to be consistent with that, notwithstanding that we have seen this very significant increase in project activity in recent years.
Okay, thank you very much. That's good. I'm now going to call David Santillo from Greenpeace, who's put a few comments in the chat, and including a reference. And I'll just ask David to comment on why a whole consortium, perhaps, of NGOs, of climate NGOs, are opposed to this type of CCS activity, particularly in the context of what Samantha and others have explained, that CCS is not just about, or maybe will not be about at all, developing coal-fueled power plant in Europe or anything, but actually can cover a whole swathe of the economy and direct air capture and lots of fundamental industries. So I don't know if David is able to speak briefly or not to that.
I can try. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but not see you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening with my camera. Apologies for that. But just to say that, yes, I heard that discussion, and just to note that Greenpeace was mentioned specifically, but Greenpeace is part of a much broader grouping of NGOs that have long-standing concerns about carbon capture and storage, not just from a technical safety point of view, an environment point of view of what happens to the carbon that is captured, how secure the storage is, what the safety is of those particular operations, but primarily because what we've seen so far and what we've seen projected into the future is that very much that this is about finding ways of maintaining a fossil fuel industry, maintaining that focus on using fossil fuels rather than looking at maximizing the options that we have for energy efficiency, for renewable energy, for product reformulation, and ultimately for changing our relationship with current models of transport and overconsumption. So, and perhaps, one example of why those concerns exist is when we start to talk about the shift away from CCS to CCUS. And I think for as long as a big part of that U is for enhanced oil recovery, I think you can probably understand why there is a great degree of skepticism within the NGO sector for just what this would mean in terms of support for the fossil fuel sector. Given the situation we're in relation to climate change, I think to take on board a promise that although the fossil fuel industry, coal, oil and gas, has been the primary source of that problem until now, they can now be the primary solution. I think that you can understand why within civil society there is a great degree of skepticism about that, especially given what we've seen so far about the progress regarding carbon capture and storage, and now carbon capture utilization and storage. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at the Climate Action Network position statement. There's a lot of detail in there. There may be things that you agree with, there may be things that you disagree with. The purpose of that document is to make sure that that debate is a live one. And I would be very happy to hear any comments that people have, after this meeting. And if I'm not able to answer those, then I can put people in touch with those within the Climate Action Network that can do that.
Okay, that's good. Thanks very much, David, for putting that position. Of course, people are welcome to respond to that. I could abuse my chair's privilege by having a direct conversation for half an hour, but I'm not going to, because there's some interesting points there on both sides. But has anybody got any immediate reactions to that? Anybody want to comment on that? No hands up that I can see.
Maybe I'll just
All right, Samantha, yeah.
If I can just add in terms of this idea that CCUS is going to save the fossil fuel sector. You know, this is not, there's no future pathway that's consistent with climate goals where we have any kind of business as usual pathway for fossil fuels. And
right, so for the benefit, Samantha, did you answer your question fully and extensively, Samantha, or do you want to redo it?
Not quite. I just wanted to make the point that, you know, for example, in our analysis, the net zero pathway, we see coal use declining by more than 90%. It makes up less than 1% of energy needs in 2050. So, you know, CCUS is not saving the coal sector, for example. So I think we need to put the role of these technologies in some perspective there.
Yeah, I'm going to come back since you and I can have a debate about this because we're online. What about China and Russia? Because again, you know, it's clear that there are, you know, 4 or 5 really big actors in the world, and if we can clean those up, we've really got somewhere. And even if the rest of the world stops burning coal and behaves very sensibly, then China single-handedly could continue and drive the world past its 1.5 and past its 2-degree limit. So what's your perception of what will happen?
Well, I mean, China is, of course, amongst the countries that have pledged a sort of net zero, or at least carbon neutrality commitment for 2060. And on the 29th of September, the IEA will actually release a detailed roadmap for achieving China's objective of climate neutrality. So I would highlight that you know, we see very strong potential for CCUS in China, given the scale of their existing power infrastructure, but also industrial infrastructure. I think around 50% of all cement production is currently in China. So,
yeah,
you know, CCUS will be a really key technology. And since the president's increased climate commitments, we have seen more activity around projects, particularly in China. So I think we're going to start to see China, which has long been involved in CCUS R&D and pilot projects, really starting to focus on commercial deployment of CCUS in the next decade.
Yeah. So do you say 29th of September or October? I didn't get
September.
that down. September. That's an IEA release then.
Yeah.
And has that been developed in partnership with China, or is that a document written in Paris?
It was, well, we've had extensive consultation with Chinese stakeholders, and it's been prepared at the request of the Chinese government.
Okay, that sounds very positive. So fingers crossed. I'm short of official questions. We've only got 42 participants. So if anybody's got a question which hasn't been asked or answered, then please do duplicate it, because on my screen, at least, the Q&A and the chat have been wiped out. So I'm going to, Scott is on, hopefully still. I don't know if Scott's on. I was going to ask Scott, what do you see from the UN work you've been doing, though?
Stuart.
Yeah.
Scott had to leave for the same meeting as Juho. And there was a question from Paul Fennell that I noticed in there, and I can see that he has rejoined, so I can allow him to talk, to ask his question if you'd like.
So I think Paul's question was, is the UK putting in a serious amount of money compared with what the United States is doing? Do you want to speak to that, Paul?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, that was basically the question. I mean, when you look at the amount of money that the US is putting in, there was for commercialization of next stage technologies. They're putting in somewhere in the region of $300–400 million. We're putting in somewhere in the region of bugger all, maybe not quite bugger all, but for specific commercialization of CCS technologies, the UK is far behind. I'm not talking about things like IDRIC. I'm not talking about development of general decarbonisation technology. I'm talking about specifically carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, and I'd also comment to the meeting in general that in Edinburgh, Andrew Kavanagh and I have done an analysis of the build rate necessary just for the storage part. And unless we actually drill something like 20 wells in the next, drill and fill something like 20 wells by 2025, then we can't get there to the UK's ambition because you can't develop the wells fast enough. So this is a problem that, and I'll ask David Reiner to comment about what you've written in the Q&A in a minute. That you could indeed drill, baby drill, but there's zero incentive for big oil companies to get involved in that. So we're stuck in this credibility gap that there's lots of warm words and lots of possibility, but also perennial lack of action. So I don't know if David Reiner wants to talk to that.
Well, one question I suppose is the extent to which, I appreciate what Sam is talking about, which is kind of this is what needs to be done, but to what extent do you try and capture the reality on the ground of what these commitments are? I mean, it's I don't think it's quite as bad for the UK government maybe as Paul makes it out to be, but at least there's a very big question mark maybe over whether the kind of the requisite funding would be available. It's very easy, as Stuart says, to have warm words. It's much more questionable as to whether that actually translates into building actually deployment in the late 2020s, early 2030s.
And that's too late, I think, to get to the declared ambition. So we should have started 20 or 30 years ago. So we're perennially reframing this that we have to start immediately, whereas actually we should have started 30 years ago. So we're already 30 years too late. So CCS and 2 degrees will not match, in my opinion. So I think CCS will, CCS can deliver, but it'll be sometime in 2080 or 2100 by the time we get there. And I've no idea what the weather forecast will be for them, but it's generally not good. So I'm not that optimistic. So right, so the risk of damaging your health, Miles, do you want to make a short intervention? And I do want to draw this to a close because we're now 4 minutes past. So a quick intervention from Miles, and then we'll just go to the recent comment in the Q&A after that.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to put in an appeal. I mean, as long as we're talking about how do we get more money to CCS, I think the conversation is doomed.
Yep.
Government money to CCS. And that still seems to be I think David said something just now. I can't remember exactly what David said, but how do we persuade our governments to spend more on CCS? I think is the wrong question. We need to be asking, how do we stop fossil fuels from causing global warming? And the obvious institution that has the resources to do that is the industry itself. And that's where we need to focus our attention.
Yeah. And I would also argue the whole point, to put it less politely than Stuart, Jenkins and Miles have done, the job of government is to govern. So government should just tell oil companies what we want from them. And if they don't produce what we want from them, they don't get to operate anymore. And that's quite straightforward, really. And that, I don't know who anonymous attendee is who's commented in Q&A, but anonymous attendee says Greenpeace is actually at the polite end of the spectrum on CCS, because as we know, they do have a science unit and do analyze stuff. But what if you engaged with Extinction Rebellion, or what if you just bypass the whole thing? So I don't know if anybody's got any other commentary on that, but I do think, that there's too many reasonably polite people in the room, and government has no money to spend on this. Stuart Jenkins want to say something.
Yeah, I think I think kind of just echoing previously made points, but this is where a CTBO type policy is quite valuable, because it does reframe the CCS action as a regulatory measure on the fossil fuel industry, as opposed to a measure which is keeping them in business. It frames it as an action which is a requirement for their operation within that marketplace. And so it does have the potential to, but well, it kind of does the two things that a CTBO can target is increased capacity and investment in CCS, whereas otherwise it's left behind. And it can be used. And the second is it acts as this backstop policy, sorry, whereas where you guarantee that at least if the CO2 is emitted, it is ultimately recaptured and stored. So it does slightly reframe the conversation in the eyes of kind of NGOs, I guess, a CTBO policy.
It may do, yeah. And I'd argue it also embeds the true price for the true cleanup cost in the price of the product, because the price of the cleanup will have to be done by the oil company or the gas company extracting the product. And we're all paying too little for fossil carbon at the moment because none of us are paying the cleanup cost. Right, Miles has inevitably put his hand up. So last commentary from Miles, and then I'll close out.
I just want to end on a cheerful note.
Good.
You could argue, because let's face it, my life's pretty miserable at the moment, but you could argue that the fact that the environmental movement is not supporting something like a carbon take-back obligation is a reason to be optimistic. Why? Because they think it might work. Maybe the fossil fuel industry would actually do it, and then we wouldn't have a climate problem. I'll leave you with that thought.
Right, that's a Byzantine thought for me anyway, but thanks to everybody. I'm going to close out now, technical glitches notwithstanding. So thanks to the 40 odd participants who are remaining, the 6 organizers and speakers who are remaining. Thanks to everybody for speaking, sticking with us.